do apologise, I'm sort of recovering from the cold or the computer virus, it's hard to tell. My background is in computer science, so that's sort of my explanation as to why. And sort of I shifted from that sort of very computer science background to more of an HCI focus, and then sort of into urban informatics, where I've been doing my PhD, looking at urban agriculture in various forms, particularly in Brisbane. So rather than talk too much about what urban agriculture is and all the good things that it can bring to the urban environment, because as you're aware, urban populations are quite a thing these days. I'm rather just going to focus on the synthesis of 3 studies which I've done throughout my PhD, which have sort of looked at 3 urban agriculture communities, or 3 types of urban agriculture, which sort of range from communities to individuals, and also sort of differ on the scale between sort of small and large groups. And the research approach that I've taken sort of smells a bit like ethnography, in that I was sort of trying to immerse myself in what was going on with the urban agriculture groups I was interacting with. So the first group I was dealing with was North Street City Farm, which is located just north of the city here in Brisbane, a couple of kilometres north of the CBD. And I did a few months participation there as a volunteer, as well as conducted a few interviews, just to try and sort of learn about how they work, how they operate, and why they do what they do and how they actually go about doing it. And some of the interesting things that came out of that was the importance of face-to-face communication, which makes sense given the sort of very location-centric nature of Northey Street. It's quite a large farm, so with a preference towards face-to-face communication, it's easy for communication to get lost if decisions are made across the farm and not everyone's entirely aware of what's going on. The other issue they have is actually this breakfast creek that runs nearby, because the actual spot, Northey Street, is on a floodplain. So in 2011 and 2013, they actually suffered some losses and some damage due to floods, and in fact even this year they, for an unrelated reason, had to shut down some of their operations due to possible contamination at the site. And that was quite interesting. That's obviously a very location-centric community, and it's a fairly large community. By contrast, Permablitz Brisbane is more of a grassroots sort of movement. I participated at a large, quite 6 Permablitzes, which are these events that they run, and that's primarily what they're about. They're about sort of organising and helping to run these sort of day-long working bees to sort of overhaul someone's garden according to a permaculture plan. In terms of the sorts of things we found there, sort of from my interviews and participant observation, they're very dependent on volunteers, and they have issues with volunteer burnout because for the people involved in organising, it can be quite intensive, and they can be quite enthusiastic, and it's easy to get burnt out when you're putting a lot of time in voluntarily. They also have a very large focus on encouraging local communities. So they don't want to see themselves as an authoritative or sort of prescriptive body, deciding what is a Permablitz event and what isn't. They'd rather just be a source of knowledge and then sort of help other people to actually get their own things up and running. So they're interested in sort of being fairly decentralised. And then finally, I looked at residential gardeners, and this consisted of a few methods of data collection. We surveyed a group of about 36 people, interviewed a couple of experts and had a focus group with some experts. And when I say experts, I mean people who are involved in teaching gardening as part of what they do. And in fact, one of those people was Peter Canny from City Food Growers. We also did a converged interview process with 7 residential gardeners in and around Brisbane, and as part of that I also got them to sort of sketch up what they actually do in terms of their own backyard garden, and this is sort of some rough sketches of how the layout's gone in relation to their house and so forth. And a couple of the big things that came out of that was that in urban environments, when you are gardening and gardening in your backyard, gardening is at best it's a hobby for a lot of people. It would be quite rare for gardening in an urban environment to be a full-time job for someone's residential backyard, and as such, the time commitment that people have available to engage in it is quite low. Similarly, in terms of where they source information, accessing the internet is something that everyone's pretty familiar with doing and is quite happy to do. But when you're searching, you go jump onto Google and you search for some information about how to grow something, or what's going on with this plant, or what does this mean, and then you're sort of dealing with a few issues. Firstly, you're dealing with issues related to sort of how many different opinions do you want, because on the internet you can sort of find every opinion on a problem, and that's sort of related to how gardening itself is not, it's not an exact science for the way sort of residential gardeners practice it. If you try and plant something and I try and plant something, it's the same thing, it's in very similar circumstances, we live in roughly the same sort of area. You might be successful, I might fail, but we try to do everything the same way. And the other issue is that a lot of information that is online is targeted towards the northern hemisphere, and this is quite problematic because, sort of as we found out, location is very important as to what's going on. So the actual process went through with the data that we collected. We obviously derived themes from that, and from these we sort of I was thinking about these in terms of the design considerations, as well as what is the actual design response we can come up with to deal with that consideration for each of the 3 cases sort of individually, and I've come up with as a sort of preliminary at this point 4 design patterns, which I think if you're going to engage with designing attractive technology for urban gardeners, from regardless of whether you're dealing with a particularly large or small organisation, you need to consider. And the first one is the management of resources, and resources are obviously different depending on the type of urban agriculture and the type of community that you're dealing with, because for individuals, time is a much bigger concern than many of the other things listed, whereas for, say, Northeast Street or permanent, access to people and money is quite difficult as well. Understanding the amount of space you've got and how you can use that space is also incredibly important. And next up is understanding that location is central, and sort of this sort of goes from understanding that not only is the hemisphere you're in going to make a massive difference, but also knowing that you're in Australia, knowing that you're in Brisbane, knowing that you're on the coast. These all make massive changes as to how information is relevant, how you would actually go about gardening practice. And it also affects the local communities and local suppliers that are going to be relevant to a given situation. So next up is the idea of sort of this feedback loop, or being able to reflect on the gardening practice and This is particularly important because for say with Northey Street, they need to be able to make decisions as they go on the fly, and because they prefer this sort of face-to-face communication, you can sort of lose track of what decisions have been made because they do actually operate with a very flat hierarchy structure. In the case of permablitz, they want to actually make the events that they run very celebratory to sort of encourage more people to get involved, and this being able to reflect on that is going to be quite helpful, or would be quite useful. And similarly, finally for residential gardeners, it was the most common thing that came up in the survey, as well as something that came up in every interview, was that the actual process of learning to garden involved a high level of sort of experimentation and observation. So reflection is very important for how they engage with that. And then finally, the appropriateness and trustworthiness of information. So when individuals go online, how many different opinions do you want on a particular gardening practice? It's sort of not that exact science in the way people engage with it. And similarly, when you're engaging with social media, it's not necessary, like you can't simply say, just use social media, that's a good way to connect with people, because for individuals it might be because, they like to talk about what they're doing with gardening with their friends and family, but for someone like Northey Street, where the information and decisions and what's going on is more relevant to the people within a very, narrow geographic region, they actually don't trust a lot of social media. Or at least that's something that came out of the interviews. They do make use of social media for advertising some of their things, but it's not very, very central. And in the case of permablitz, they're interested in using social media, but they're quite limited because of the resource problems they've had to deal with. And so the future direction that I'm going with these is to actually, develop, and I have actually developed a prototype sort of storytelling device to try and help people go through, this reflective process with gardening, targeting mobile smartphones because, prevalence of smartphones is very high in Australia, so, that will actually consider the resources people already have in a lot of these situations. And I'm sort of at the point where I just need to sort of test and evaluate that with people who actually find out how it can impact their gardening practice. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Tad?
So I'd love to hear more about the actual prototype. Like, what are some of the features that you plan to test it, all that kind of stuff? Like, what did you actually, where does all this go in terms of design?
In terms of the actual design of the prototype, so I haven't really prepared any slides or material on that as yet because it's a work in progress. But the application itself is designed so that you can. I wanted it to be fairly easy to use on the go because I know in the case of especially Northey Street, they need to be able to, it just needs to be able to integrate with how they communicate now anyway. So, looking at taking pictures, recording audio, rather than sort of, getting them to fill out lots of text because that's not very appropriate for sort of lots of data entry on a mobile phone. And then, if your story is about, and it could be helpful for them in terms of their decision making as well as, keeping account of what's actually going on at the farm. Whereas for individual gardeners, it's more of a tool for sort of sharing with other individual gardeners, and sort of all this information is sort of geotagged anyway, so, taking account of, or taking stock of where things are happening, just so that you can sort of keep the location context will be there. But I'm trying to keep the interface fairly simple in terms of how it works, but certainly there's, capacity to to comment on and sort of share information. And in fact, being able to sort of log in via social networking sites and share to social networking sites, I think is important, but is not something that everyone will be interested in doing. Big one? I'll start over here and work that way.
No, I was just wondering, like with your interactive design for you, do you look up matching up wildlife corridors as well, or in the design, or are they just planting for planting's sake? And are they natives or are they just food?
I think planting natives could be a very interesting thing to actually provide a lot of, sort of useful local information. And I think, yeah, especially in terms of understanding the local context, understanding, the local bush foods could be very important. But in terms of the information, I'll be able to get onto the sort of prototype. I'm not sure if I'll, it won't be my focus, but it's something I'm certainly interested in.
Hi, teacher. I have a question. You mentioned trustworthy information. So can you talk more
Yes.
about that one? From which aspect to creating the trustworthy experience?
So in terms of how I might create trust in the information that's advertised there, I think there's a couple of ways you can go about this, and rather than try and have an authoritative person actually go through any information that is made available through the stories and say yes, that's correct, no, that's not correct. You can it's a lot more realistic to use some sort of reputation system similar to. Have you heard of Stack Exchange at all? Okay, they're an online platform. They've done their first big project was called Stack Overflow, but they've done which was Stack Exchange for sort of programmers, which is how I initially found out about it. And they've done a sort of large number of these Stack Exchange deployments where essentially, the more engaged you get, the more reputation you get, and so people are able to, if you're asking questions through your stories and people answer them, they can say, this was the answer that helped me most, and the more often, particular people are found to be, yeah. Someone over here, ish? Or is that all?
Can you give me an example of how I use that as a home garden?
So you can use it as a process of, there's a few ways that you could possibly use it because it's a fairly flexible system. You could just use it to actually journal your gardening, so on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, taking a few photos, explaining what's gone on, and then being able to reflect on that, so you can see how things change over time. If you encounter something that's particularly strange or unknown, you could be taking images of it or sounds of if it's a particular pest, and then actually essentially crowdsource and ask the community for advice on how best to deal with it, or whether it is even a pest at all.
Sounds like a boggy meeting. Next one.
No, actually, I haven't.
Well, you need to go. Just listening to the research you've done, have been to a boggy meeting between zone. You haven't done your research.
I've interacted with a lot of people who've been involved with boggy, but no, I haven't actually been along to boggy itself.
Yeah. Surely they do all sorts of researches there.
That's Brisbane Organics Growers Inc., I think. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter.